Hello everybody, tonight we're working on the Chapter 5 practice exercises. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I do have my book open to that page, page 243. But I also have a file folder window open, and as you guys should be getting into the habit of doing at this point, you guys will notice that we are going to be working on our web calculator project. But before I begin working on it, I'm going to be safe, and I'm going to take the version that I was working on last week and create a copy and paste it right back into the same folder. And I'm going to rename that copy, since I know it's complete. I'm going to name it Chapter 4 Complete, and now I have a backup. I will be working, of course, in this main folder, but this is a habit I'd like you guys to be in. And if you're not doing it manually, there are actually versioning tools that are built right into Visual Studio. I really don't spend class time talking about them because, time is precious. But if you're familiar with services like GitHub, for example, you can actually link your GitHub account to your Visual Studio and create versions right from within Visual Studio. And a lot of developers do like to work that way. But at the very least, if you do this mechanical approach, it really does create a little bit of a peace of mind. All right, so I'm going to jump now over to Visual Studio. I'm going to pull my ebook off to the other screen here to save on a little bit of space. All right, and the one thing that I noticed that the book is pointing out is they're saying in step number 2, this is top of page 244, that if you didn't complete the exercises in Chapter 4, you can use the starting version of Chapter 5 from the source code files. And you can, but one word of caution when you're using these older files is sometimes there's little artifacts that follow that are not quite right. So if we have like errata that hasn't been corrected, it might follow in. However, it can be used as a starting point if your work is really that bad. I would think not, because I don't think the exercises have been all too difficult yet. But just please keep that in mind. All right, so let's go ahead and open up the project that we've been working on. So I'm actually going to go to File, Open, Website. And we went through this last time, right? Was this the right choice to make? I say and pensively wait for an answer. It can be, right? Yeah, it's a yes and, that is correct. It's a yes and no. Because what's happening here is, you notice how I went to the folder where my solution is, and there's another folder inside of it? This is actually where the website sits. We were having some issues last week when we were opening directly into the folder. Am I right? All right. I'm still going to be brave, and I'm going to work directly in that folder. All right? And it's okay if you don't. If you would rather use the solution that's listed in your quick start, do that. That's fine. What I'm trying to show you is that really you should be able to get the same thing either way. Okay, so now my project is open. And they want us to make sure that the default HTML file is set to be the start page. So I'm giving it a right click and then choosing Set as Start Page. Next thing they want us to do is actually launch it to make sure that it's loading up the way we intended. Now, if you remember what we did last time, we created the calculator, we put a little bit of CSS on there, a whole lot of purpley kind of colors, right? Purpley blue. And we came up with something that looks kind of like this. Now, if you were adventurous at all, and I challenge some people, go out there, you want to change the CSS and make it look like something different, go for it. There's been times where I've had more classroom time, and I sit there and I'll put in like different fonts and make the buttons look different ways and just play with the CSS. They give you a certain type of look that they built and they want you to follow. There's no reason why you couldn't change that if you wanted to, and I'm absolutely fine if you do that. And I'm just putting it out there because how do you learn about things? By experimenting, basically. So you might come up with a look that looks really cool. All right, so that seems to be working just fine. It's launching okay. I'm going back over to Visual Studio and then making sure that it's not in web server mode anymore. And now I'm on step number 4. In step number 4, they want us to open the default HTML page, so I'm going to click on that, and there is my code. And they want us to wrap a div element whose ID is calculator. Okay, I'm trying to read this correctly. It says, wrap the div element whose ID is calculator. That would be this one, right? With a div element and set the ID to container. And this is actually a pretty common developer technique. And so basically what they want you to do is this. It'll auto-generate the closing tag, but really it wants you to wrap that whole calculator div with that tag. So that's the result there. And I'm going to close my output window so I can squeeze it all in so you can see the result. So here's the new div, and all that div is responsible for doing is encapsulating everything else. And depending on who taught you Web 1, folks, I know that if I taught you Web 1, I would tell you this like a gazillion times. And it's really one of the tricks to doing good web layout is if you're struggling with getting stuff to sit right on the page and you can't get the margins right or the padding right or the positioning right, one trick is to wrap it and put something around it, and then all of a sudden it gives you another layer of control. Because not only can you control the objects within, you can control the object holding it. And that was really what we did when we put the calculator together and put a big box around it so that we could center it, put it in the middle of the screen. And now we're adding another layer of encapsulation, basically, to allow for another level of control, because there is a goal here to basically take this and insert it as a page into something else. That's kind of the objective here. And what enables that to happen is just encapsulation. So if you ever look at somebody's site and you go like, why do they have a div inside of a div inside of a div? Or whatever elements inside of others, it's often because of that. That is something that, most textbooks won't really necessarily put in place as a main thought. But I can tell you from, working in the field for a number of years and just talking to other designers, that is a trick that you learn by doing, right? So that's why I like to share it, because I think it's a pretty important one. Okay, and right now I lost my second screen. Isn't that great? Where my book is, so I'm looking for the next step. And I can't see if my recorder is running, so I'm going to try to see if I can... All right, that's great. Can't even pause the video. All right, well, I'm just going to roll with it. I'm going to close my PDF and try to relaunch and maximize to this window. Of course, I can't see it. There we go. This is where I rescued myself with a shortcut key. Why that second screen's not working, I don't know. But you guys are still catching my broadcast here in class? Okay, good. Tell me if not. Back to chapter 5. All right. All right, in the container div element, insert a header element containing an H group. So basically we're going to be creating this little section of code, and since it just happens to be sitting here, I think I'm just going to copy it. It's easier than typing it. And from the way I read that, they want it right here at the top. So I want you to notice, and one thing I see real commonly with young web developers is this confusion between the header tag and the head tag. You don't ever want to put header elements up here, right? And the head element is not a visual part of the page. So headers should always go in the body. And I wish they would come up with a different tag for up here, but it is what it is. Now, the header implies what? It's at the top of the page, right? And what's an H group? Have you guys ever learned that tag? Never heard of that one. That is an HTML5 tag, and what it allows you to do is basically to group things inside of a header into logical components. The purpose of it, encapsulation. The encapsulation basically giving you more control over what you see. So what they're doing here is header text, so they have an H1, so you can have a big Contoso limited, and then H2, which is a little bit smaller, which apparently is their tagline. All right, next thing that we're going to do is we're going to insert a nav element, and right away they want us to drop in a link, and basically the link is going to be back to the home page. So we're going to put that after the header. And this, what you see here, is actually a pretty common type of layout. Notice, and maybe you don't think of your pages like this, that even though I have a header, and that's a distinct section that would be at the top, right? And as many websites do, they'll have a navigation section right below it. And then we'll get into the content. In this case, it's the calculator. But notice that all of these things are sitting inside the container, and the container is sitting inside the body. What advantages that give us? That allows us to control everything on the page collectively, excluding the body tag. So I can take all the content, and let's say I don't want it going from one side of the screen to the other. I want it all narrowed up in the middle with a little bit of a margin on each side. Well, that allows me to do that because everything will be inside that element. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do that to the whole page. So that's one of the whys. All right, so now we have a header, an H group, a couple things inside of it, and a navigation area. All right. The next thing that we're going to do is now we're going to wrap the calculator inside of another div element, and notice that it has a different type of attribute that we're throwing in, and that's one called a role tag. So what do you guys suppose the role of a role tag is? Maybe it was in your readings? And how is that different from, let's just say, using a div tag with an ID? Now, I'm not sure if I just did that twice. I think I just did that twice. Okay, we don't want that. And what was that you said? Yeah. That's kind of an interesting thought. There is an HTML5 tag, and I'm going to tell you what, to this day, depending on what editor you're using, that's actually called main. And that's a legitimate HTML5 tag. However, some editors don't recognize it as being a legitimate tag. Now, what's the difference between those saying that something has an ID or maybe has the tag main, but what does role sound like to you? That's exactly correct. This is the main thing. This is what this page is really about. This is the main thing. That's what it's saying. It is of sorts, but it has a special type of meaning. But my question to you is, what does it have a meaning for? It wasn't the readings. This is my informal midterm exam. It's either an F or an A. You guys choose. It is. It is. It's intended for special devices. In fact, it's intended for what we call ARIA devices. And I forget what that acronym stands for exactly, but it is like the association of, I don't know, whatever. Look up what it means. I don't know what it is. But it basically deals with people with disabilities using certain types of devices, and it communicates information to those devices as to what the main purpose in this case is for this document. All right. There's also a number of other different types of attributes. In fact, you guys also learned that you can have custom attributes that you can add. And there's also ones that you see like this, the rel tag. And very often, and very interestingly, this rel tag in the early days of HTML5 was often used by certain authoring platforms. And I'm thinking, for example, of like Dreamweaver and the jQuery mobile library. So in the jQuery mobile libraries, it's a special library of JavaScript files that would allow you to create mobile interfaces really easily by just adding a rel tag. So when you say something is role navigation, it creates a whole look in CSS automatically for you. So with some tools, it can actually accelerate development. And a lot of mobile stuff is done that way. So when you're more apt to see a rel tag on mobile devices or pages intended for mobile devices or for weird like screen readers and braille readers and things like that. So that's the why. So create that one. All right, so after the main div element, they want us to drop in an aside. So that's going to come right down here. It's another one of those semantic HTML5 tags. And then below that, they also want us to insert a footer. So let's drop that in as well. Now this type of a structure is pretty common. Encapsulating elements, a head section at the top, navigation right below it, a main content area, structured however. Sometimes we'll have an aside or a sidebar either on one side or the other or both, and then a footer. And those are really typical page construction techniques. All right, if you haven't done so already, do a Control S to save or hit the little icon, your choice. And then what they want you to do is look at this code and make sure that everything is laid out the way they intend, because they know from their description that things don't often lay out exactly the right way, and I already see a mistake. You guys see it? You guys notice below the footer there's a div tag? Okay, here's my container, right? Here's my main, here's my calculator, that's my calculator, that's my main, right? And then this one is my container. All right, let me show you a little trick that I've used over the years that might help you prevent a problem like that happening. Because really, Visual Studio is pointing out to me that this is problematic because it is underlining it, right? The problem is it doesn't know where to insert that closing div. So here we go. I know where it goes here. But in the old days, what I would very often do, whenever I would work with a lot of divs, and they become disassociated from one another because they're so far apart in the code, is I would often insert a comment. And I would do something like that. And that way, I'm not guessing which one it goes with. Now, a tool like this, which I can select all and format selection, it'll lay it out and indent it so then I can figure it out. That's great. But what if you're on like Notepad++, or worse yet, Notepad with no line numbers, it really can create a problem. So I really like that approach. Not one that you have to copy, but in the old days I would do this very extensively because I really found that it helps me keep track of my things. So you'll often look at my old code and I would say that kind of thing. Okay. So and I think it's a good practice. Don't be afraid to put comments in, folks. They don't hurt a thing. All right. Next step. back to the book here. There we go. Well, that was it. That was exercise 1. That was nice and quick. Ready for exercise 2? If you were at this point looking to see, it didn't even ask us to run it, did it? I'm going to run it anyhow. I hope that's all right with you. I want to see what I created. Should it look any different? Let me ask you that to start with. No. Oh, yeah, it should have the head. Oh, but where are they? Refresh. That's right. Remember, stuff gets cached. Yes, it should look different because we did add content to the page, although hideously so, right? Like, thing that you guys should notice is, even though black does contrast with that, like, you know, deep blue, purpley background, it's really not readable, and it really isn't readable when you start looking at links like this. So obviously we need to do some changes here to really make it look better. And I would encourage you to do that. But really what they're doing is they're taking all of what we built, they encapsulated it, sitting in the middle of the page, and now we can have header, navigation, footer, and side, and lay things out in a much more appealing fashion, hopefully. All right, so on to exercise number 2. All right, next thing we're going to start to do is tweak the CSS. And they want us to open the default CSS file. And notice what the author is doing. I wonder where they got that one from. So the CSS file for this project is actually in the content folder. I always thought that was weird, but that's where they put it. Doesn't really matter ultimately. But they do want us to add a line at the top here with a universal selector. And this is one I discussed in class last week, where they go margin 0. And actually, I should probably stick with their proper format, which is like this, you know, with the carriage returns and padding 0. And let me ponder a question for you. Why is it not 0px or 0m? Yeah, why just 0? It doesn't matter. It covers it all. It covers all of those scenarios. Now, if I were to say margin 10, then I better have a px or a point or a m or something with it, because otherwise it doesn't know what it's doing. But with margin 0 and padding 0, remember the reason that we do this is this eliminates all the default styles for any element that has them built in and forces you to override them manually. It initially seems like a bad idea because when you see it break your page, but when you're trying to do pixel perfect control, it's the only way to make it happen. And you will get in those scenarios. So I, as a rule, do this to all the websites I build. Just as a rule, at least those 2. We talked about those resets last week as well. So, all right. And notice they're using the convention, they put it all in one line, and that's absolutely fine. The other thing that we want to do is we want to add kind of a primitive, and I do call it primitive, HTML5 reset. And what the reset does is this enables, and you might even put a little thing in here that says, enables non-HTML5 browsers to display HTML5 content. So, in other words, if your browser was unable to understand these new HTML5 tags, by including display block, it forces them to display. And this is also a technique that you can use to create your own tag. Like if I wanted to create a tag called Alex, right? I could create one called Alex, tell it to display block, and guess what? It will show up. It will work. Interesting. All right, but that's kind of a safety net. So there are more advanced ones that you can use, but be careful with this. This is something I think these days that we can probably avoid. If you really know that you're going to have people viewing with old equipment, for a fact you know that, then you want to put that stuff in. All right. It also has some adjustments to the body styling. And let's go in there and find that. Now, I'm not sure if that background color is changing, so I'm just kind of leaving it in place. Oh, it's actually a little bit different. Well, that's smart. Why? Because that color that was there was kind of what? Yeah, pretty bad choice. A purple calculator on top of a blue background. Not really the best aesthetic choices. All right, so go ahead, do a Control-S to save if you haven't already. Next, we're going to add a new folder to our project called Images. Notice capital I. So I'm going to come up here to the root of the project, and I'm considering the root where the little web calculator is in bold with the little planet Earth next to it, not the solution. All right, and from there, I'm going to right-click, add, new folder, Images with a capital I. Why? Because that's what the book is doing. And that's kind of a Microsoft convention. All right. Now, in the files that come from your book, so if you went to the publisher's website, you could download source files, right, including the source code. And if you were enterprising, you could also go to our course shell, which I actually have open here, go to the resources page, and notice that you can actually download the zip file right here, this one under textbooks file, and you can dig through the zip file, find the right chapter, find the right folder, and find the resources, right, and get those images pulled in. I did do something that really should help you a little bit, and I'm trying to remember which one it is. I think it's this link here. It says link to shared files, and if you click on that, they're going to be guiding you to find an image, and what I did is I just put them out on my Google Drive and shared them here, and that way you don't have to go zipping, unzipping, looking through folders and all that. You can just come here and grab what you need. And the one that they need us to grab, see if I see it here, is a file called contosologo.png. All right. So what we want to do there is find a way to get it into that folder. And you notice they have a series of steps here that they're suggesting that you use. And what they're really suggesting that you do is this, which is right-click, add existing item, and then go find it in your folders. Now, mine's out in my Google Drive, right? So it's not really in my folders. Well, actually it is, but for the sake of demonstration, let's pretend like it's not. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come out here to the website, Contoso logo PNG, that was the one, right? I'm just going to give that a right click in the drive and then do a download. It's going to drop it into my downloads folder. So I'm going to do a show in folder. So there it is. And then what you can do, if you guys aren't aware of this, or maybe you are, is you can actually just drag and drop it right into the images folder. That works too. If you want to follow the book's approach of right click, add existing item, whatever, as long as it gets there, right? All right, so there's the image inside that folder. All right, so step number 6, it says after the body style rule, insert a header style rule. And since they have all the details right here, I'm just going to grab that. Let's drop that in. And let me ask you a real quick question. Why not just put this style right at the bottom? Would it work any different? No. Is there any logic that you can think of that would make sense to put it there? Well, I mean, when you look at the structure of the page, that's really one of the first tags inside the body section. So I do the same thing as I often try to position stuff in the CSS kind of sort of relative to where it would sit in the document. So if I'm looking for a footer style, it should be towards the bottom. If I'm looking for navigation, it should be towards the top. Just an easier way to find things. Do you have to? Absolutely not. Doesn't matter. All right. I do want you to notice here that this has, for the URL for the background image, this dot dot slash, and I know you guys probably have learned about this, but what's the point of a dot dot slash? It goes up a folder, right? Because you got to think the CSS file, where is the CSS file sitting? It's inside of a folder. So in order to point to an image, it's got to go up a folder first and then start looking. That should be something you already know. Can't always assume that, but sometimes you need a little refresh. But that's one thing I see getting people quite often, especially when they start taking their style sheets and they move them out of the root of their project and they start moving them into folders. And that same thing happens with JavaScript files as well. That'll often be one of those little things that gets overlooked and causes a world of problems. All right, next thing that we want to do is add this section of style, and I'm going to have to copy this in two pieces because otherwise this extra stuff's coming in. And I'm actually going to put this right after header, and I know it's incomplete. I'm coming back to get the rest. And so here's the style they wanted us to add. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this particular style that they've chosen to add and give you what I'm hoping is maybe not necessarily sage advice, but the voice of experience. And I always cringe a little bit because I struggled with it so much whenever I see this position absolute. Because what does position absolute do? Yeah, no matter what you do on that screen, no matter how you resize it, how big it is, how small it is, what browser, it doesn't matter. That object will always appear, the header text, in that position, 0 pixels from the top and 80 pixels from the left, no matter what you do. Now that can be used to your advantage. And in fact, it's one of those tricks, like if you think about like going to some websites where they have like a navigation bar that's at the top, and no matter how often you change a page, or maybe it's at the bottom, that just stays there, right? Or if you go to, you know, what I always think of is like really annoying pop-up ads. They're usually done with absolute positioning. We talked about this last week a little bit too. But I'm always really cautious. Like if I was really designing a site, I would probably skip that approach because it can cause so many problems. There are times though when it can fix problems too, so it's always taken with a grain of salt. But whenever you use something and you put absolute position on it, folks, it breaks the page flow. That means all the things that are on the page are now ignoring that object is there, and it will exist where it exists, whether something is there or not. So that means things might be on top of it, things might be behind it, or things might be appearing in the same space, and it might look hideous. So this won't be able to be moved, but the other things would be able to be moved. So one thing that happens is we might force that in there with an absolute position, and the other stuff that would normally sit there, we're moving it down or over to make it work around that. So important, definitely. All right, we're also going to throw in some styles for H1, H2, and the nav. So I'm just going to grab those and drop them in. And I'm just going to keep adding right in this spot here. So there's one for H1. There's one for H2. I know you guys can read these and what they're doing. Pretty basic. Here we have a navigation. Notice the navigation does have a float on it. All right, and this is something that if you watch the lecture videos or read the book, it goes through a little bit of explanation. But whenever you start floating objects on a page, right, we have objects that we fall into two categories, inline elements and block level elements. And when you start taking an object and moving it and making it smaller than it normally would be. So a block level item always wants to fill up the whole width of whatever is containing it. And that, make sure that you understand that part of it, right? So if I'm sitting inside the container and I tell something to be 100% wide or width, it fills that container, not the whole page, right? And then when I start to take anything and take it away from that 100%, which is default for block level, and make it either a percentage smaller or ems or pixels or whatever, and I start floating it, it starts to change the page flow. So anything that would normally follow it, all of a sudden is going to try to creep up next to it. So that can be leveraged stylistically, but it can also come and shoot you in the foot. So be really careful with that. And notice that another thing that the author is doing here is they're doing this minimum width. So not only are they applying a width of 20%, but they're saying that if the page gets so small, don't make this any smaller than 125. So whenever you're doing responsive designs, especially with media queries, this is an important consideration. So often you'll see something set to a width, pixels or percentages, and people will start setting max widths, min widths, and a width, all at the same time, and have it float. So it's completely adjustable, but operates within certain parameters. What those parameters are depends on your project, and it can take a lot of tinkering to really get it right. So whenever you're messing with that kind of stuff, be patient and be methodical. Always work top down. Because you got to remember, if you're trying to move something at the bottom and the top is broken, then you go fixing the top, and now all of a sudden the bottom is broken. Don't do that to yourself. Ask me how I learned that one. Dozens of times I've turned it absolutely wrong. But you know what? I'll tell you what, that's sometimes still the best way to learn. Hit yourself in the finger with a hammer about 20 times, and then you start learning to move your finger. Automatically. You don't even start to think about it. All right. We also are going to apply some CSS to the role attribute. And of course, you guys should be saying, couldn't I just put an ID on it? Absolutely. Couldn't we just use the main tag? Absolutely. You absolutely could. But what they're doing here is kind of showing you a combination of things that you can apply styles to attributes. Not really a common practice by developers, but it can be done. We're also going to style the aside. Notice that the aside also is getting a float on it. And then finally, we are going to do some styles on the footer. Notice that the footer includes a clear, and a clear is one method, probably the more common method, for removing floats so that things don't continue to float. So that's an important thing. So if you know that you have a couple elements that are going to float, make sure that you do a clear float after so that things return to normal page flow, because that can cause problems as well. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to set a style then for the container. And on that one, we're just basically controlling the width of the container. Guess where I'm going to place that? Right underneath the body tag, right before the header, because to me that's where I would put it, right? Because that's where I would look for it. Body comes first, container comes next. Just keep them in order. Notice that the only thing that we're placing here is that the container is a minimum width of 800 pixels. So you can get the screen down to the point where it's 800 pixels, and like the screen you're looking at right now, this is 1600 pixels wide is what I'm working with. So like half of that width is as small as that main container is going to get. That type of technique, very common for responsive design. So a minimum width of 800 pixels. All right. It says in the existing style rule for the calculator, change the height and the width. So they're setting height and width to 400 for each. So let's copy those. And that's inside the calculator, wherever that happens to be, right there. See, right now they're set to 500. So we're switching those to 400. I guess I could have just typed it in, but oh well. And then we're also adding a font size for the input and the button. They're changing that to 20 points. See if I can find that one. That's this one here. So it's a little bit smaller, which makes sense, right? We just made the calculator smaller. And then they show you a completed version of the style sheet. And you don't have to have stuff in this order, but I think mine is fairly close to this order. So if you finish that, go ahead and hit your save button there. Hit the play button and let's see what we got. And I'm going to do a refresh because I know this isn't refreshed, right? How do I know that background color? I know that changed, right? Didn't it? Why is it not changing on mine? Let's try Control F5. There we go, right? Now, there's still some aesthetic issues here, I think, but certainly that's a better background. The calculator can much more easily be seen. A little bit different size. We have a logo at the top. We have primitive navigation, which I don't like because it's touching the edge of the screen, right? So that needs a little work. We do have a sidebar where it says advertisements, and we do have a footer. All of them in very rough form, but we did manage to make some edits here. And I believe that's the end of the exercise, so given that being the fact, we are now going to pause here in class because we are at the halfway point, almost exactly, and take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and finish up the next exercise. I am going to attempt to pause the video, even though my recorder, for some reason, is on the other screen. So while I try to figure that out. After a short break, we are now back, and we're going to work on the third exercise here. And if you don't have it open, please open it back up, but I never closed mine, so it's still up in my Visual Studio here. And they want us to work on the default HTML file. All right. So the one thing that they want us to do to help kind of clean things up a little bit, it says surround the inputs and buttons with a table element. And what they're hoping for us to do is, and I'm going to pull the book back over. I moved it off screen to get it out of the way, but now I'm pulling it back over, so I want to bring it back in. So the general directive is this: surround the inputs and buttons with a table element. Now, that doesn't mean you want to put a table tag around each one. That means elements of a table, right? So table rows, table data cells, headers, bodies, whatever. And they have an example, for example, of what you should do. So they're giving an example of the result box, the one that's read-only, and how they're putting a table row around it, because clearly if you were to look at an example, and it's probably better to look here, right? If you were to look at this and think about placing the whole calculator into a table, this would clearly be one row of the table, right? So would this, but then this one would have 3 data cells inside of a row, etc. Now, you might say to yourself, "It looks fine. Why are we doing that?" Well, that's what they're telling us to do. So this chapter is partially about tables too. And I wouldn't necessarily do this as a design choice, but remember the little adage I gave you at the beginning, which is tables always work and they're always consistent. So that's one of the reasons why people use them. So the thing that I want you to be really cautious about here, though, is the fact that they're kind of giving you the code in pieces. I'm going to cheat a little bit because I know that after a while they give you all the code. So guess where I'm going to? I'm going to that part. Okay. And I'm hoping you guys are wising up a little bit and doing the same thing, because really what I want you to do is get the concept more so than necessarily worrying about being like doing it step by step. So I am going to be copying this stuff in. It is exciting, but this video doesn't last forever, Richard. I'm gonna lose subscribers if I do that. So I'm leaving the old code in place, folks, and I'm going to drop in the new code before I go deleting the old code. That's just a work habit of mine, and I encourage you to find little habits like that help you. Here I'm noticing that I'm going to have a hard time grabbing all this code at once, so I'm probably going to zoom out a little bit in the book and see if I can find a way to grab it all at once from this silly little PDF. right, it seems to all be in place. I'm trying to close that output window here at the bottom. So now I'm feeling comfortable enough to maybe grab all these inputs, and I'm not going to press the delete button. I'm actually going to do a cut. And why? Just in case, right? And these are the kind of things you learn over time. If I was really nervous about what I was doing, I'd actually open up a different editor or a different file and drop that code in so I don't lose it. Or I might even just comment it out. But these are just little work habits. The last thing you want to do is have to type it all back in. But I am going to go through here and review the structure and realize that, okay, I got a row, there's only one data cell inside of it, and it's got a column span of 4, meaning that we're building something that's got 4 columns, apparently, right? Same thing with the next one. And then with the subsequent fields, you're going to notice that we have, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of TDs, which you would expect for a 4-column setup. And then each button is getting placed into the mix here. All right, and that seems okay. So I feel comfortable at this point. I'm going to do a Control-S to save, and we'll move on to the next set of instructions. All right, and that is one kind of long set of steps here, and that puts us now at the top of page 256, step number 7. And here's where we're going to start to add in a little bit of CSS to control the table. And remember, I was telling you earlier that is really kind of one of the modern moves here, is in the old days, if we wanted to declare the table a certain width, I would just come right up here into the table tag, and say width, right? And then I would just say equals, I don't know, whatever, 800 or whatever it is. You don't have to put pixels in because it's not a style. Pixels are assumed. And would that work? Yes, it would work. It is considered, and often the validators online will squawk at it a little bit. That'll say, don't use width attribute on a table, use CSS instead. But it really doesn't matter. This is a sideline. But they want you to get into this habit, and I think it's a smart habit to get into, because really, when you start to separate that and you're controlling this stuff externally, it does work much better. So I'm going to grab the CSS for the table. We're going to set its width. And what's it going to be set to? 100%. 100% of what? The containing element. If I look at my HTML, this table sits inside of the calculator, so it can only be as wide as the calculator will allow. The calculator has padding on the inside. That's part of that 100% too, so I can't exceed that padding. We're also going to set a width for the table data cells, and what they're doing here with those is they're setting these, because there's 4 columns, to 25% each. That makes sense if there's 4. Some CSS for the button, and really all we're changing here is the width to 90%, if I'm reading that correctly, and I'm just double checking, and that is correct. So instead of width of 25%, they're making it 90%. I'm on step number 10 now, so we got the input control that we're styling. And it says change the padding to 5 pixels. So I'm looking for input. So instead of 10 pixels, that's changing to 5. Now they want us to go ahead and hit the play button one more time. And we got a little bit of a style change. Maybe not quite what you expected, right? You might have said it was better before. But if you think about how a calculator is actually laid out, it is kind of more like this. Usually the clear buttons are separated. Usually the 0 key is centered underneath the numbers. And then the plus and minus and the operators and equals buttons and all that, those are all off to one side. Okay, so we were able to get it to look like the picture that's in the book. And just so you believe me, that looks pretty close, right? All right, and that actually completes Chapter 5 exercises. That wasn't too bad, folks, was it? All right, and the one thing I'm going to tell you is a lot of the stuff that's later on in the book will go just as fast as well. So when we get to the point where it seems like, oh my God, I got to do 3 chapters worth, you'll start freaking out, and then you'll realize that, oh wait, it goes pretty quick. Right, but we do have a couple chapters that are coming up. I can't tell you exactly which ones they are offhand, but some of the ones where we do some JavaScript and some of the APIs, they take a little bit more work. So on those, I don't want you to get frustrated, but I do want you to always keep your due dates in mind, because I have been tweaking them a little bit, and you're going to see that the homework now is not always due a couple days after class. It's kind of peppered in at weird intervals so I could make it all fit. So please make sure you try to stay on track. Always keep in mind that if you turn in something by the due date, you can turn in the rest with no late penalty, right? So take advantage of that. But try to get your stuff in on time as much as possible. All right, this video ends here.